He missed out one thing, though. I like to think of myself as a meditator as well. And this talk is essentially about meditation, or at least about the kind of mental states, the kind of experiences, the kind of heart experience that can be achieved through meditation. So I did have a title for this talk, but when you're asked to do the title, it's months in advance. I always find that very difficult because you have to give the title long before you've written the talk. So there was something in it about open your heart and let the rain come in. Seems a bit foolish now, doesn't it? Anyway, forget the title. I did a talk here last year, and I did say something about my own experience on that talk, and I'm going to say more about my experience, not just of meditation, but why I came to meditation. So, as I said last year, I had a period in my late teens when I did quite a bit of travelling, hitchhiking. And I suppose I was kind of interested in the meaning of life already. But I started to have particular experiences of the power of being alone in nature. So I'd be hitching a lift somewhere beautiful, say southern France or something like that. And the cars would come and the cars would go, and I'd be, come on, I'm going somewhere, why don't you stop? And there'd be a great big car with one driver, you bastard, you know. And there'd be a whole process of maybe getting frustrated, getting angry, and then the whole bubble bursting and just thinking, hang on a minute, I came here because I wanted to be here. And actually I'm in a beautiful spot. You know, there's beautiful trees and greenery, the sort of things I don't get in the city. Lovely blue sky. Let's just enjoy it. And I would kind of melt, I would relax. And actually that is the best way to get a lift as well. But more importantly, I would come into being in relationship to what was around me. Instead of, the kind of active thoughts and the activity of going somewhere, doing something, I would find myself giving that up and just turning towards my immediate experience and realising that actually that was very enjoyable. So in that way, I sort of discovered awareness, deeper awareness. And, you can't travel all the time, but I did have a couple of sessions where I travelled for a month or two at a time. And each time I could get back into this state of deeper awareness, even though in between my life took over and things went pear-shaped and, all the usual stuff. And I remember that the second time I went travelling as a teenager, I hitchhiked down to Greece, and I was on my way back, and I'd had some of these what to me were very special experiences, and I was in an open state of mind. It hadn't been easy all the time. I remember getting quite depressed at one point, thinking too much about life. But then the thought came to me, because I was thinking, but nothing has any meaning. Nothing means anything. And then the thought came to me, well, actually, it's the other way around. Everything means something. It's just that you're looking for something particular. So you turn it around, and instead of nothing meaning anything because it's not the way you want it to be, it's everything means equally something important and something beautiful, because you've let go of that kind of wanting. So those were kind of spontaneous experiences that I had just through being alone, being in nature, and having to sort of slow down. But I remember right at the end of that cycle of travelling, I was on my way home, and those of you who've done this sort of thing, by the time you're on your way home, you don't have much money left, do you? You're sort of getting by on the minimum till you get home. Otherwise, you'd have stayed longer. And I was somewhere well on the way back, and I remember I just had, a small amount of food for my lunch, just a sandwich, and I happened to be sitting next to someone else who was travelling. And there was just this desire to share with them. And, despite their protestations, splitting what I had, which wasn't hardly enough for one lunch, into two, so that we could both have at least the same amount. And maybe I've been influenced when I've been travelling in some countries. People are much more open-hearted and generous than they are here, and they often do you a good turn even though they don't know you. But I was very aware that in that giving there was a kind of peak experience. Even though I'd been sort of spontaneously cultivating awareness, and I was aware that that awareness was deeper or higher than my usual state of mind, I knew there was something special about this sharing. It was only a moment, sort of, in a way, an easy thing to do. But it was the joy of sharing that I knew was special. It was the feeling of fellowship with a stranger that brought about that sharing. That was the special, in a way, peak moment. And I realised somewhere in a kind of incoherent way that, even though it's easy to be unaware, it's easier to be aware of things, of nature, of trees, of grass, because you have less expectation of those, don't you? I mean, you sort of accept, if it's boiling hot, what can you do about it? It's boiling hot. If it rains, it rains. But with people, you tend to like certain people for certain reasons, and therefore it's harder sometimes to be fully aware, fully present with another person, really take them in and just respond. So for me, that was the kind of first moment in my life of that kind of response. And I knew that was a kind of deeper response again than just enjoying nature on my own. It was a sharing. So when I came back from those travels, I realised that I needed to cultivate those kind of positive states of mind. And intuitively, I thought meditation would be the way to do that. And it was. I met up with some old friends, some of whom were just about to go to a meditation centre that had opened in the town we were living in. And I thought, right, that's it. That's what I want to do. And coming along to a Buddhist meditation centre was an important event for me. It was the beginning of a process. And one of the first things that I learnt in that meditation centre was a meditation called the Metta-bhavana, the meditation on loving kindness, the cultivation or development of loving kindness. So metta is difficult to define, but we usually use loving kindness because in our use of the word love, it's just got too many meanings. You can love a piece of fruit as much as a person in our language, but it's not really like that. So loving kindness, and this is a meditation that goes back to the time of the Buddha. Whether it was in existence before the Buddha, we don't know. But if it was certainly something that the Buddha made a lot of in his own teaching. He gave it an importance along with body awareness and breathing awareness as a form of meditation. And the kind of way he talked about it, it was a radiant love, a kind of burning love of others that he was talking about. Not only something that you held in your heart, but something that went out to others. And in the traditional Buddhist texts, it talks about pervading all the quarters equally, the whole universe equally, with the same kind of love. And that love would be equally strong towards all different kinds of beings. Buddhism's always had a very expanded view of the kind of beings that exist. It's not just us humans. It's not even the animals. They're included as very important too. But the Indian tradition that Buddhism came out of thought of all kinds of tree deities, deities of place, different forms of life. And the Buddha suggested that one could have this same all-pervasive, radiant love towards all those different beings. It's also the basis in some of the Buddhist texts of a very interesting effect on others. it seems that if you do have that kind of really strong, radiant love, it's very difficult for other people or other creatures to feel threatened by you. So there's a story of how a maddened, enraged bull elephant was unleashed by someone who was jealous of the Buddha, with the thought that this elephant would kill him. It was unleashed into his path. But the Buddha just stood his ground, and as the elephant came forward into, as it were, his circle of love, it simply calmed down and stopped and was at peace, and at peace with the Buddha. Interestingly, sometimes you see a visual depiction of the Buddha's enlightenment. And immediately before his enlightenment, Mara, the sort of personification of distraction and disturbance, unleashes this sort of terrifying army on the Buddha. So in these pictures you see all kinds of ghouls and demons, hurling hatchets and arrows and spears at the Buddha. But as they come into the Buddha's aura, in the pictures you see they turn into flowers, and they just fall to the ground as flowers. And I think that's very much getting at the same kind of thing, that this kind of radiant love is itself a protection. So usually we try and meet force with force, we try and meet hatred with hatred. And of course, one of the Pythia sayings of the Buddha is that hatred met by hatred will never end in love. Only meeting hatred with love will bring peace. So the Buddha actually recommended the metta bhavana, the loving kindness meditation, particularly for forest-dwelling monks. You get this even now in places like Thailand or Burma. You get people who've decided to lead a full-time celibate monastic life, and they don't even live in the cities in a monastery. They go off into the jungle and they try and live there, meditating and maybe just going to a local village to get a bowl of food once a day. But obviously in the jungle, well, it's a dangerous place, even a terrifying place. And in the Buddha's lifetime, one of his own monks was bitten by a snake and died of snake bite. So this worried the other monks. Well, will that happen to us? Is that the way our lives will end? We want to practice meditation, but before we get to the goal, will we die in the jungle? So the Buddha said, no, if you practice metta bhavana in this way, if you can cultivate this kind of really radiant love, all the animals will cease to fear you, and it's only out of fear that they attack. I mean, actually, snakes usually run away as soon as they hear your foot tread, but unfortunately for the monks, they're taught to walk very mindfully and quietly, so perhaps the snakes didn't hear them coming. But in any case, even though the snakes would perhaps be initially afraid, because they are afraid of human beings more than we are of them, and quite rightly so, but the aura of peace and love around that person would calm them down and make them feel unthreatened, and they wouldn't strike. So that's kind of putting it in historical perspective. Has anybody here done the metta bhavana? How many of you? And how many of those would have done it on a regular basis as a practice over the years? Quite a few of you. Okay. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'll just briefly mention the meditation practice as I was taught it. So it has 5 stages, and you begin with yourself. This can get a bit complicated in our society because we don't always love ourselves. But the idea is to make it as easy as possible to start feeling love. So you start feeling love towards yourself. And you try and get in touch with the fact that, behind all the complications, we want the best for ourselves. I mean, we often don't know how to get it. We often make a big mess of it. But the feeling behind it all is that we want to be happy. We want to be successful. We want the best for ourselves. And that's the feeling that we're trying to get in touch with. From there, we move on to different kinds of people. And that means a friend, someone we know and like, someone we don't know at all, to either like or dislike, or at least know so little that we neither like or dislike them. Sometimes called a neutral person, but they're not neutral to themselves. It's just that we don't have any particular feelings towards them one way or the other. And then it's someone we don't like, someone we don't get on with, someone who upsets us, treads on our toes in some way. And we try and feel the same feeling of loving kindness towards them. When we've spent some time on all of those stages, we broaden it out. So it would go something like this. If I was leading a meditation, I would be saying, now think of all the people in the room. Try and feel loving kindness, try and feel warmth towards all the people in the room here together. After all, we're sharing the space, we're sharing the experience. Try and have sympathy towards all the people who are here. And then I would say, now try and take that out towards the whole of the Buddhafield Festival. Feel love towards everybody out there, all the different kinds of people that have come to enjoy this festival together. And then I would say, now go beyond that. All the people who are not here but still live around in this country. Feel metta towards them. And I might say something at that stage like, think of all the different kinds of people, and not just people, but all the beings that we're surrounded by. So men and women, old and young, rich and poor. So in that way, you try not only to spread your love around, as it were, but also to take in all the different types of people and then all the different types of beings that exist wherever they are. And eventually I'd be saying, now take that out wherever there's life in the universe. So that's more or less how I was taught to do the Metta Bhavana. There may be other ways, but that's how I was taught. Now, I practiced the Metta Bhavana on a very regular basis, probably daily, more or less, over a number of years, once I'd learnt it. And I was very keen to do meditation, and I was very happy with the context I'd found for doing that with other people who also wanted to do the same thing, which isn't always easy to find. But nevertheless, I didn't find it very easy, particularly the Metta Bhavana. I got on rather better, I think, or at least more quickly, easily, with the other meditation I was taught, the mindfulness of breathing. I can't say I found that easy. It needs to be practiced and practiced regularly. But I got the hang of it more quickly. The Metta Bhavana seemed a little elusive. What did you do when you didn't have that feeling? And where was that feeling anyway? I mean, you sort of come back to yourself and you think, yes, may I be well, may I be happy. Yes, may I be well, may I be happy. And you know, it's all evaporated, even if you felt quite happy at the beginning. Sometimes when you kind of try and concentrate on yourself, you just get a bit tangled up in knots. So I would often feel that I wasn't really feeling metta. Yeah. On top of that, probably I was feeling I ought to be feeling metta, because after all, I wanted to meditate and I was doing a practice about developing metta, and now I wasn't feeling it. So now I felt worse about myself because I wasn't feeling it. But sometimes, you know, I did feel quite happy and I could feel it for myself. But then, how did you send it out to other people? You know, what were you supposed to do when you thought about a neutral person? Well, you didn't have any feelings for them. So I gradually worked out a few ways that worked for me. For instance, using my imagination a bit. If I was thinking about someone I didn't know, I would just start thinking my way into it. Well, obviously, they've got friends and family who do love them. I'm not one of them, but, you know, they've probably got a lot going for them that I don't know about. And then what about that last stage of the people? We often call that the enemy. I mean, you know, it's quite hard sometimes even to call that person to mind if they're particularly upsetting, let alone concentrate on them for 5 or 10 minutes. And what do you do if you're still seething? You know, what do you do if it doesn't transform? Now, sometimes the practice worked, otherwise I wouldn't have kept it up. But my overall feeling, having done it for a few years, was perhaps slight disappointment with myself in doing the practice, that I wasn't a more loving person, and that I didn't more spontaneously. I mean, I like my friends, of course, but, you know, I can't say I found it easy sitting in meditation, beaming out metta to the whole universe. I loved the idea, but the actual experience of it was often a little more gritty. So then another experience I had from my life, which kind of showed me where I was really at with it. My parents live out in Africa, they still do. And I took a break from what I was doing, helping to run a Buddhist centre, and went to visit them in Africa. And as it happened, there was quite a lot going on in the family context while I was out there. We had a maid. This is very common in Africa. It's not particularly a racial thing. People who can afford it, whatever race they come from, just employ a local person cheaply to come in and do the cleaning and tidying and things like that. But she was someone that I'd known, you know, when I was still at home as a child, and she carried on with the family. And then she'd had a medical difficulty, so we had paid for her to go to a hospital in another town, because my aunt had had the same medical difficulty and recommended that particular doctor. So she'd stayed with my aunt and then gone to hospital for the operation, come back to convalesce with my aunt. And while I was there, my parents travelled, it's about 250 miles or so, to go and pick her up and bring her home. She was a live-in maid. Now, unfortunately, it was the rainy season, and the rains there are really torrential, really tropical rains. And on the way back, there was a big rainstorm, very difficult to see. And suddenly, my father saw a truck coming towards him on the wrong side of the road. Someone had got into trouble already further up the road, and he'd swerved to avoid them, but he was now coming towards my father. I wasn't in the car. For some reason, I decided I didn't want to go. They'd said, "Do you want to come?" And I thought, no, I'll just stay here and do some meditation maybe, or read a book. So he swerved off the road to try and avoid the truck, but it hit the back of the vehicle where this woman was sitting and killed her outright. And then, I didn't know what was going on. I was staying in their house. They didn't come home on time. I tried to find out what was going on. I got in touch with a family friend. We phoned the police. Then we found out there'd been an accident. Eventually that evening my father turned up. My mum was injured. She'd been taken to the hospital. My dad was just very badly shaken up. But I learnt the news that this, old family friend, really, by then, had died in the accident. But what emerged over the next few days that was particularly tragic was that many of her friends were expecting to welcome her back after a successful minor operation. So a steady trickle of people started coming to the house to inquire after her. And as I said, my dad was very shaken up. But in any case, I wanted to kind of shield him a bit from that. And I started to go out to meet people. He was feeling quite guilty about having been the driver. And I started going out to meet these people. And I had the job of telling them that their friend had died, which to them was very unexpected. It really was a minor op. And they were expecting to just see her convalescing at home. And I suddenly found, that a real experience arose of this kind of transcending metta, where you really feel it for other people. I could feel for those people. I could feel for the shock that I would have to give them. You know, here they were happily coming in to the drive of the house, and I was the one who would transform their whole experience. They would never see that friend again. So, in a way, I could only really do that because I was sustained by feelings of metta. And I really opened up to that experience and opened up to them at that point. But afterwards, I realised that I could only do that because I'd been cultivating the metta bhavana as a meditation practice over a number of years, and that for some reason I wasn't able to actually experience those feelings in the meditation. But nevertheless, I put in the effort, I put in the time, and when the situation arose, that meant I could handle it in a very, very different way to what I would have done before meditating. So I realised that regardless of what your meditation experience is in the moment, something is going on. You're doing something, you're learning something, you're reorientating yourself in some way, and that will stand you in very good stead, you know, when you need that. So why are those experiences not always there in meditation? I think that's the next question one asks. You know, you're doing this amazing, inspiring sort of meditation practice. It's very idealistic. Is it because it's too idealistic? Feeling love for the whole universe. You know, when you respond to it as an idea or an ideal, it's very inspiring, but is it just unrealistic? Is it just not possible? Is that why I got in trouble? Is it a bit too romantic? Or is it just for those special occasions when your help is urgently needed and you can respond at last? Why is that feeling not always there? Not just in meditation, but why isn't it there anyway? At least for ourselves and at least for our friends. Well, it's not too difficult to work out, but I'll tell you another little story which again very well illustrated for me what goes on. So I said that my parents live in Africa, but they also have a small flat in England and they come over once or possibly twice a year. And on one such occasion, when I was living in a community at a Buddhist centre, I took the tube train in London to go and visit them in their flat. So I was on the tube, passing the time. I don't know how you pass the time on the tube. I look at people. That's what I do. So I was standing. There weren't any seats. So I looked at that half of the carriage. And then, when I got bored with that, I turned around and looked at the other half. But literally, back to back with me was my own father. I didn't know he'd already gone into central London on some business. And he was coming back to be there to receive me for tea, and we were on the same train in the same tube carriage. Now I have to say, my relationship with my parents has not always been a good one or an easy one, particularly around the time when I was travelling and exploring things and becoming a Buddhist. That was very much outside their kind of comfort zone, and when I changed my name, that was pretty drastic from their point of view. Went to live in a Buddhist community, all those things they were not very happy with. And we had, you know, initially, before I started meditation, and they were not very happy, we used to have big arguments. Later on, I learnt a bit more about how to relate to them positively and applied that to our relationship. But still, it wasn't always easy to understand what their feelings were towards me. And that was a bit painful. Particularly with my dad. Men are more reticent anyway, generally speaking, in our society. So as soon as I saw him, I said, "Dad!" And he turned around and he said, "Dave!" That's my old name. And there was this wonderful meeting, full of warmth and love. Makes me tearful even just saying it. Because all the barriers were down. It was so unexpected for both of us that none of the usual barriers were there. And for the first time since I was a child, I could actually feel how much he loved me. In about 5 seconds, it all got very formal, and he sort of stuck his hand out, and we shook hands and, carried on having some inane conversation. But that was an incredibly precious moment for me. But it made me think. It made me think afterwards about what does get in the way of expressing our feelings. I don't think it's simply that we hide them. It's not simply cultural. It's much more complicated than that. We are much more complicated than that. So it becomes a universal thing. It's not just to do with fathers and sons or something like that. We're sort of inherently, in our unenlightened selves, complicated. We complicate everything. We complicate our lives and we complicate our relationships. And we do that basically by wanting them to be all sorts of things that they're not. That's the simplest way of putting it. So we have expectations, don't we? And people have expectations of us. So you see me here wearing a kesa as an order member, expectation. All the time we are seeing people, we're projecting onto people even. But we're seeing them from the point of view of our views, our previous experience, before we've got in touch with them, before we've been with them long enough to know anything about them. I mean, they say this happens in a few seconds when we first meet people. But we don't drop it even when we do get to know them. And in fact, in a way, the more deeply we get to know people, the more frustrating we find it. It may be okay to realise that a stranger, is different from how we thought they were going to be. But what when it's a lover or a son or just a good friend who doesn't do what we would like them to do? They aren't capable of being how we'd like them to be. I was not able to fulfill my parents' expectations. My father had desires. He was an engineer. He didn't like it when I wasn't very good at physics. They're quite basic things, but we do this. We try and put people in our pattern. I really find this quite extraordinary. I come across it a lot, even in Buddhist circles. As Vajrayan said, I've run more than one Buddhist centre, and it's a very rare person that realises that there's more than one way of getting from A to B. So something will come up in a meeting. We need to do this. Everybody agrees we need to do this. But everybody disagrees about how to do it. And when you look at how people disagree, everybody is being very sensible and rational about how they would have to do it. The only trouble is they're not going to do it. Someone else is. So people very often won't let the person who's going to do it simply do it in their own way. They try and channel things so that people do it in the way that they would have to do that task. So it's very basic in our unenlightened nature. We're not even talking about ideas and opinions. We're talking about something much more basic, deeper, grittier than that. Yes, we have our likes and dislikes, and they can be really weird sometimes, can't they? I mean, there was a guy I didn't get on with. He's a friend now because he's a Buddhist and we had to put up with each other over a long period of time. But I really took against him. And I took against him, I realised once in Metabhavana meditation, putting him in the 4th stage, because I disliked him so much, that the only reason I could really think of that I disliked him was he was tall and gangly with glasses. Sorry if there's anybody of that particular physiognomy here, but it was just ridiculous, But all the time we're kind of putting that out. We're seeing people in our own strange ways without realising it. So that's the complication that I'm talking about. And that brings me back again to the Metabhavana, because I think the Metabhavana is a kind of working ground where you can recognise what you're doing. you're setting up in your mind these relationships with significant people. I mean, you change day by day, week by week who you choose. But over time, all those are significant relationships that you're working with, that you're finding out about, that you're finding your way round or through, finding what works for you. And that can take quite a long time, because you're dealing with something very, very basic. You know, your ideal has to meet the real, and now you're dealing with the real you. The idiot who doesn't like people because they're tall and gangly with glasses. You know, even though you aspire to be this wonderful, loving person. I talked last year in the talk here mainly about the 5 hindrances. According to Buddhism, all these complicating factors can come into one of 5 hindrances. And particularly in relation to other people, 2 of those hindrances particularly apply. Inappropriate desire, or some kind of dislike. I mean, it can be stronger than dislike, but it starts there. Those are the kind of things that get in the way of our awareness. And going back to my initial experience, just of meeting that guy under a bridge when we were travelling and sharing a sandwich, you've got to be there, you've got to be present to respond to somebody. I mean, you don't have to call it love, but if you don't see them, if you don't meet them, if you don't feel them, then whatever you're doing is just coming out of your own head. It's not to do with them. So you have to be aware to meet someone. You have to bring that awareness to a person. To bring that awareness to a person, you have to cultivate awareness in yourself generally. And you have to untangle the web, the knots that get in the way. So I think that this feeling of metta is really an opening up to another person. I mean, in a way, the feeling is a red herring. Sitting there hoping to have a feeling is actually a red herring. That's not really what it's about. It's training yourself to have a response. That response can be taking place in your heart, or it can be taking place in action. But what you're doing in meditation is working with the responses that you do have, learning to recognize them, learning to overcome some of them, learning to cultivate others, so that when you meet a real human being, you're more present, you're more open, you're at least partially free, somewhat free of all those entangling expectations and thoughts that get in the way. Really what we're talking about is recognition. So I think when it comes down to it, we're probably talking about a basic human possibility that we have sort of most of the time failed to bring into existence. So when you talk about cultivating something, it's not really something that you have to learn exactly. You need to learn about yourself and how to work with yourself. But like when I met my dad back to back and we turned around to face each other, I think if you can only fully recognize another human being as a human being, or an animal as an animal, then you can have an appropriate response, and you can call it what you like. You will be responding to that being from your being. So it's a kind of being to being recognition. And following that recognition is a being-to-being response. And that brings you back to something spontaneous, which I'm rather pleased about, because, you know, it would be awful if there weren't natural, spontaneous responses that we could have. The proviso is to cultivate them often needs a considered deliberate effort over a long period of time, which brings me back to meditation practice. So you've got meditation as a practice, metta bhavana as a practice, but you've also got metta as a kind of natural response. To the extent that you can free yourself of your unenlightened, entrapping idiocies, you can have that response to others. So yes, that ideal is achievable. I'm quite sure that it is eventually possible to have that response all the time to everyone. In the meantime, it's nice to have it occasionally and at least have it reaffirmed that you too can have that sort of response. So we need to learn to be present to others. The best learning place I've found is in meditation practice. There are no doubt many other ways that we can learn. You do need to learn in relationships. Your meditation practice isn't much good unless it actually works when you meet other people. But I think if you're meeting people, sooner or later you're meeting them in adverse conditions. I mean, it's kind of relatively easy. A festival, we're all chilling out, the sun is shining, maybe a bit too much, but we'd rather that than the rain, probably. It's easy to respond to people, it's easy to be more aware. But without something that you do on a regular basis, like a meditation practice, something you do to cultivate your responses to others in the privacy of your own heart and mind, then I think you'll miss the opportunities that are there, that are present. And the way you are just affects the way the world comes back to you so incredibly strongly. I'll just finish with one story from my life which encompasses that. I was driving in London, an ordinary drive from A to B, and suddenly someone swerved across into my lane, smashed into the side of my car, and pushed me right up against the railings at the side of the road. So we're coming up to traffic light junction, and they had suddenly decided no, they weren't going to turn right, they were going to go straight, they hadn't looked in their mirror, and I was in the way. But you get an awful lot of feelings coming up in that situation. And interestingly, the car was being driven by a woman, but it was her boyfriend who was sitting there who got out, her partner. And he didn't realise that it was actually her mistake. So he was really angry, I was really angry. And you're blocking up the junction. So the first thing you have to decide is that you're going to get out the way and you're going to pull over somewhere else and start talking. But the initial contact between us was very hot. You know, what are you playing at? What's going on here? Now, one of the ways that you are taught to work with the hindrances is to consider the consequences. And for me, that's a very powerful way. Do you want to go there, basically? Do you want to be this kind of person doing this kind of thing? And after a few seconds of kind of blazing up, I thought, this is crazy, you know, because if this gets any hotter, it'll end in blows. So it just occurred to me that, you know, because he was saying it's your fault, I was saying it's his fault, or rather his partner's. And then I just said to him, look, it's not up to us to decide. We're both going to file with our insurance companies, and they're the ones who are going to decide. So why bother arguing about it? But it was the experience in meditation of seeing the consequences that made me change, or gave me the opportunity to change, because I could see where this was going and I did not want to go there. So that kind of cool things, he thought about it and he said, well, I don't want to go through insurance. Actually, I don't think he had any, otherwise he probably would have. But that meant that he then had to give me a name and an address, and he said, you know, I don't have enough money to sort it out straight away. You'll have to come and get money off me in a couple of goes. But can you, before you agree anything, take it to a garage, find out how much it will cost. So I did that. By the time I rang him up, obviously his partner had said, no, actually, it was down to me. I didn't see the guy. So he was quite apologetic. He said, you know, could you come round to our flat collect the first instalment. We got so hot, I was still very trepidatious. I made my girlfriend come with me and sit in the car. And I said, if I'm not out in 5 minutes, call the police. But when I got there, you know, here was this guy, ordinary guy, very decent about it, handing over an envelope with a few £10 notes in it, whatever it was. But I had to make another appointment to go back. And the second time I went back, it wasn't him, it was his partner who was there. And she said, oh, come in. I'll just have to look for it, you know. So you get invited into someone's house, which is already, you know, unusual with strangers. And then she started looking around, and she was clearly studying. The place was full of books, and I thought, oh no, you know, I mean, it's poor people. I wish I didn't have to take this money from them. Then I heard a baby cry in the next room. But it was such a transformation, because by that time, again, you know, I'm responding to real people. And you care about them. I mean, I took the money, I had to get the car sorted. But it became a really human interaction with both parties able to acknowledge each other's humanity. It could have gone so differently wrong. And you hear about those kind of situations all the time, where the heat of the moment gets totally out of control. So I would really recommend to you the metta bhavana practice as a working ground. You know, whether on a particular meditation you feel metta or not, I would really recommend it as a working ground for exploring who you are in relation to other people, sorting it out, and having something that you can then take with you into life itself and meet all the different situations with all the different people that you come into contact with, and do better with those relationships than you would have done otherwise. So, thank you very much.